Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. As reviewed in another video, many breastfeeding mums will think at some point that their milk supply is too low to meet the nutritional needs of their baby. This is called perceived insufficient milk supply. While these perceptions can be wrong, they can also be right. Where milk supply is low is called actual insufficient milk supply. No surprises there. And about 15% of mums experience this. There are two types of actual insufficient milk supply, primary and secondary. And for more information, you can check out my video in the link below. Now, the former results from mum-related medical issues and impacts about 5% of mums. The latter results from problems with the way in which an infant is breastfed, infant-related issues or medication side effects, and impacts about 10% of mums. Treatment of primary milk supply insufficiency, from what I can tell, largely involves a medically based approach. That is, you've got to take medication or have surgery or whatever else is appropriate. However, secondary milk supply insufficiency results, at least some of the time, from suboptimal breastfeeding practices. Hence, treatment can be behaviour-based. Now, this is more up my alley, and so in this video, I'm going to review the evidence for these behaviour-based treatments. So, from what I can tell, the most commonly suggested behaviour-based interventions for mums experiencing secondary milk supply insufficiency are relaxation, increasing the frequency of milk removal, and increasing the degree to which milk is removed from the breast. I'll discuss each intervention in turn, starting with relaxation. So there's general agreement that stress, anxiety, and fatigue will result in reduced milk supply. Interestingly, these emotional factors didn't feature in the list of causes of secondary milk supply insufficiency that I've come across. But anyway, here is evidence from an out there early study which supports the idea that these emotional factors can impact milk supply. So Newton and Newton recruited one mum and measured the amount of milk her infant consumed under conditions of stress or no stress. The stress conditions involved either 1. Sticking mum's feet in ice cold water for 10 seconds out of every 30 seconds. 2. Having mum complete maths problems and giving her a mild electric shock if she got the answers wrong or took too long to answer. Or 3. Intermittently pulling mum's big toes in a way that caused sharp pain. Now, the first two are used in psychological research quite regularly, mostly in pain research, but I've never heard of toe pulling. Anyway, the results showed that mum had lower milk supply under stress relative to no stress, so there you go, stress impacts milk supply. Based on the idea that stress, anxiety, and fatigue contribute to secondary milk supply insufficiency, it's been suggested that mum should engage in relaxation practice to boost milk supply. However, only a couple of studies have investigated whether relaxation has this outcome. Specifically, a review by Shukri reported that only 2 randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, investigating this issue have been conducted. They actually said there were 3 RCTs, but one didn't look at milk supply, so I'm not counting it. One study was by Farah, and the other was by Keith. And in these studies, mums were either assigned to a relaxation condition or to a control condition where no relaxation strategies were used. The relaxation conditions involved either guided imagery or guided imagery plus music therapy. In both studies, it was found that mums in the relaxation condition had greater milk supply compared to mums in the control condition. For example, Keith found that milk supply in the relaxation condition was about 2.5 times greater compared to the control condition. However, a limitation of these studies was that mums were expressing breast milk rather than breastfeeding, and it's also worth noting that infants were born preterm or were unwell, and that the studies only assessed the benefits of relaxation for about 1 week. So you can't tell from these studies whether relaxation is helpful if a baby is being breastfed as opposed to being fed with expressed milk, if a mum who has a healthy baby will benefit, and what the long-term benefit of relaxation is, if anything. Also, only 2 RCTs have been conducted, and you'd want to see more RCTs replicating these results before getting too excited. Nevertheless, the findings are consistent with the idea that relaxation can increase breast milk supply. So now on to increasing the frequency of milk removal. So Amir and many others suggest that increasing how often milk is removed from the breast, whether through breastfeeding or expressing, can cause an increase in a mum's milk supply. And there are 2 types of evidence that have been put forward to support this proposal. The first type of evidence has been from observational studies. In these studies, researchers have investigated whether there is an association between frequency of breastfeeding and milk supply. The idea behind these studies is that if increasing the frequency of milk removal is an effective intervention for increasing milk supply, then you should find that mums who breastfeed more frequently have a greater supply of breast milk. That is, there'll be a positive correlation between the two. The second type of evidence has been experimental or intervention studies. In these studies, researchers have manipulated the frequency with which mums breastfeed. If increasing the frequency of milk removal causally contributes to increased milk supply, then in these studies, you should find that mums who are required to breastfeed more often have a greater supply of breast milk. So, first, the observational studies. Without going into detail, there are a bunch of animal studies going back 50 years or so demonstrating that higher frequency of milk removal is associated with greater milk supply. Of course, one of the downsides of animal studies is that you need to infer the same outcomes will happen in humans, which might not necessarily be the case. So this type of research is a good starting point, but onto studies in humans. So Hill found that mums who expressed more than 7 times a day had greater milk supply than mums who expressed less than 5 times a day, about 600 grams versus 300 grams per day. And this was when assessed 2 to 5 weeks post-birth. Similar results were reported by Huang and Chi. These researchers assessed milk supply in mums who breastfed more than 10 times a day and mums who breastfed less than 10 times a day across the first 4 weeks following baby's birth. In the former group, the average intake of milk by babies per breastfeed was about 70 mils, whereas in the latter group it was about 55 mils. And this pattern of results has been reported in several other studies. However, not every study has found evidence of such an association. For example, Butt reported that there was no association between milk supply and breastfeeding frequency in a sample of 45 mums and infants who were assessed over a 4-month period following baby's birth. And similar findings have been attained by others. Interestingly, one characteristic of studies that have not found an association between breastfeeding frequency and milk supply is that they've tended to have involved mums who have been breastfeeding for a while. And this has been taken to indicate that the impact of increased breastfeeding frequency on milk supply may be greatest early on. Potentially not a major issue, as difficulties with low milk supply tend to be evident early in lactation. At any rate, despite these null results, the findings reported across these studies are mostly consistent with the hypothesis that increasing the frequency of milk removal can increase milk supply. However, because these studies are only correlational, you can't draw strong conclusions about the supposed causal role of the frequency of milk removal in milk supply. And for more on the issue of causation, you can check out my video in the link below. So, on to experimental or intervention studies where the frequency of milk removal has been directly manipulated and so provides a stronger test of the causal hypothesis. So DiCarvello had mums express either 4 times a day or less than 3 times a day across a 2-week period post-birth. Mums then either maintained the same expression routine or swapped. The researchers found that higher frequency of expression was associated with greater milk supply, and similar results were obtained by Dewey and Lonadell. The findings were also replicated by Lai, but in this study the researchers found that the interval between expressions may influence the degree of change in milk supply, with the researchers recommending that the maximum interval between expressions be less than 7 hours, at least for mums of preterm infants. Finally, DiCarvello assigned mums either to a 3 to 4 hour breastfeeding schedule or to feed on demand for the first 14 days post-birth. Mums in the latter group breastfed about 3 times more per 24 hours than mums in the former group. The results showed that, on day 15, the milk intake of infants whose mums were in the demand feeding group was greater than that of infants whose mums were in the scheduled group, about 725 mils versus 500 mils per 24 hours. However, 3 weeks later, these differences in milk intake were no longer evident, despite there still being a difference in the frequency of breastfeeding. Again, this study is interesting as the results suggest that the impact of increasing the frequency of breastfeeding on milk supply may be restricted to the early stages of lactation. So, on balance, the findings support the idea that increasing the frequency of milk removal through either breastfeeding or expressing can increase milk supply. But, as mentioned, this benefit may be limited to the early days of lactation, and, as with most things, people respond very differently, with some mums showing considerable increases in milk supply and others relatively little. So lastly, on to increasing the degree to which milk is removed from the breast. So a bunch of researchers suggest that increasing the degree to which milk is removed from the breast will help boost milk supply. Despite this being a very common recommendation, I couldn't actually find many studies investigating the issue. And, importantly, I couldn't find any studies that had tested this idea in experimental or intervention studies. Instead, I could only find studies that have investigated the association between the amount of milk removed from the breast and milk supply. Now, if such an association exists, then this would lend support to the idea that increasing the degree of breast emptying could be an effective intervention for low milk supply. But you'd really want to see the experimental intervention studies that directly test this possibility by manipulating the degree of breast emptying and assessing the impact of this on milk supply. Anyway, here are the studies I came across. In a sample of 7 mums who were assessed multiple times across a 24-hour period, Daly found that higher rates of breast emptying were associated with higher rates of short-term, that is between breastfeeds, milk supply. I thought it would also be worth mentioning that babies didn't tend to empty the breast each feed. The average degree of emptying was about 75%, or about 25% of milk was left, suggesting that babies were regulating their own milk intake. And the results of this study were not replicated by Cox. However, in another study by Daly, the same pattern of results as the original emerged. specifically daily recruited mums who either were breastfeeding and or who were expressing. Again, the researchers found that greater milk removal was associated with greater milk supply, at least in the short term. So not a whole heap of research evidence, at least that I was able to find. There may be other studies out there. In fact, given that increase in the degree to which milk is removed from the breast seems to be a fairly common suggested approach for low milk supply, I'm assuming that I've overlooked a bunch of research, though I haven't been able to come up with anything else. At any rate, as mentioned, there don't seem to be any studies in which researchers have attempted to manipulate the amount of milk removed during a breastfeeding session. Again, you'd really want to see studies like this if you're going to claim that increasing the degree of milk removal causes an increase in milk supply. But before finishing up, if you're wondering how greater emptying of breast can be achieved, Kent put forward 3 recommendations. First, they suggest that mum and baby should have frequent skin-to-skin contact, particularly in the early days of baby's life. Specifically, baby should be placed skin-to-skin between mum's breasts, which can elicit the baby-led feeding behaviours of searching for and latching onto the breast. Second, in keeping with the previous relaxation suggestion, Kent argued that mum should be as physically and psychologically comfortable as possible. And lastly, baby should be held in a comfortable position where their body is facing mum, so that they naturally root for the breast. Kent suggests that the cradle hold can work well for this purpose, but they point out that there's no clear evidence concerning right or wrong feeding positions. Each mum and baby is unique. So, in summary, the results that I've seen suggest that, on balance, increasing the degree to which milk is removed from the breast may increase milk supply. For the moment though, that's it for interventions for secondary milk supply insufficiency. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.